Well, good Thursday morning. I'm Jeff Alley. This is the morning edition of the Cromwell Ag Radio Network. And sometimes in Washington, you get press releases that come from one particular subcommittee or committee, and sometimes there are comments that come from one legislator or another, or one industry group or the other. And then sometimes perhaps the influence of policy comes in letters that are written, sometimes to other groups, to legislators, and sometimes from legislators to regulators. I know I'm creating a terrible spider web here, but hey, it's Washington, okay? Donnell Rehagen is with us this morning of Clean Fuels Alliance America. Donnell, I don't know how many letters go back and forth across the way, but in this case, those of renewable fuel and especially of clean fuel, I think you're appreciative of a reaching out and trying to draw attention to the need for some new rules as it pertains to what sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel will be in the future.
Well, Jeff, you're right, and thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's very important. It is a tool that's available, in Washington, D.C. As you mentioned, regulators have a role to play in rulemaking, taking laws that have been passed and sort of interpreting them. And so many times it is helpful for industries like ours to reach back out to the legislators who actually voted on and passed those bills and say, hey, could you provide a little more clarity or a little more information to these regulators, because it's really important to our industry. And that's exactly the situation that we're in now. We really, really appreciate the broad support we've gotten from Congress. We got 16 senators and 36 representatives all the way from California to Connecticut weighing in on this. It's a very critical next step for our industry, and we just need the government to get it right.
We had a representative earlier this week from the American Soybean Association and talking about, and we're narrowing down specifically to 45Z. And people say, what is that, a new car or a new antiperspirant? 45Z is a set of rules that should come from the Treasury Department that will identify what crops or what particular raw element will be able to participate in renewable fuel. We had the 40B rule that was issued, 18 months too late, but now the Treasury is in front of a deadline on January 1, and agriculture and your groups are saying, could you get on with it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This 45Z is the new, what's called the Clean Fuel Production Credit Program. So for those of you familiar with the biodiesel industry, we've enjoyed a tax credit for the production of the fuel, the blending of the fuel for a number of years. 45Z is going to replace that. So in essence, the rules of our industry are being changed. And although we're, not sure exactly how that's going to turn out, that's what this is really about, is we're trying to get the clarity that our industry needs. 45Z, the new Clean Fuels Production Credit, will go into effect January 1st of this coming year. So, 6 months from now. We are sitting here now without any clear guidance as to how that new law is going to be applied to us. And it's in the form of a tax credit again. So if you think about that, we're at a point where our suppliers, the folks, our producers are buying inputs from soybean oil. They don't know what that input is worth because they don't know what the value of the credit is going to be. And the reverse is true as well. The buyers of our fuels aren't sure what they should have to pay for it because they don't know what the value of this credit is going to be. So just a lot of uncertainty right now between feedstock suppliers, producers of the fuel, and buyers of the fuel. And you know what happens when there's a lot of uncertainty in business? Nothing happens.
That's
exactly where we are.
And that's kind of like Washington, where there's a lot of gridlock. I don't know if you could get a piece of legislation through to agree on what day it is, much less some things that would make for common sense. A point in matter here is, and I don't mean to run further down the rabbit hole, but this is one of the things that the Supreme Court pointed out with Chevron deference. Because before, under ambiguous congressional laws, they just deferred to the regulatory agency and let them complete the rules, dot the I's and cross the T's. Well, this is a situation now where Congress did approve the Inflation Reduction Act. They did include support for renewable fuels. but they didn't write the rest of the instructions, and it's left open now. And instead of USDA or EPA, it's Treasury.
Yeah, this is a tax credit, so it is Treasury's homework assignment that Congress gave them. And there's a lot of science behind this as well, because this tax credit takes us into the realm of carbon reduction versus just production of our fuels. And so therefore, it depends on what feedstock, it depends on what fuel, it depends on what it's used in. All those factors determine what the value of that ultimate credit is. And so that's where the uncertainty is so critical for us to take care of and get cleared up as soon as possible. And that's why this letter is asking Treasury, just simply think about this. This law was passed, as you said, 18 months ago. We have no information on how it's going to be applied 6 months from now. And so what we're simply asking them to do by this letter is give us some safe harbor guidance. Give us enough direction that you will stand behind and not prosecute us by September 1st. Okay, that's the first thing. And then please finalize your rulemaking by November 1st. That's still only giving us a couple of months. And as I mentioned earlier, we're already running into issues in the marketplace of not being able to put proper values on inputs and outputs. That's happening today. And so that delay is really, really harming our industry.
Well, I want to get to 40B here. And 40B set some rules for, I'll just say, soybeans and corn. And Senator Grassley and I talked about this at length. And it was the bundling they had a problem with, that you had to do 2 crop enterprises for soy. You had to do 3 for corn before that product would qualify under the tax credit. Well, you can't set one rule planting-wise, cropping-wise, for every farmer in the country of a particular crop. And this is where Secretary Vilsack has reached out for information to say, give us practices and give us some options here so that we can advise Treasury. Farmers were left in doubt, and they still are. If they're making plans for 25, they don't know what the rules are going to be. But how did 40B affect your producers, those who take the raw product and turn it into fuel? How was that ambiguous? And what specifics do you need now?
So 40B was kind of an interim tax program. It was only good for 2 years, for 2023 and 2024, and it was specifically for the production of sustainable aviation fuel. Okay, so we looked at that. There's not a lot of sustainable aviation fuel being produced. There certainly wasn't 2 years ago. The Congress was trying to incentivize more of that, and this tax credit was a mechanism to do that. So great. But when you look at, again, how is that program going to be implemented? How do the producers of now sustainable aviation fuel understand what that tax credit is worth? The guidance on 40B didn't come out until about 2 months ago. So we're a year and a half into a 2-year tax credit, but that 40B, because there was not a lot of SAF being produced, we really looked at the guidance coming out for 40B as being kind of a foundation for how 45Z, which is the Clean Fuel Producers Credit, including sustainable aviation fuel, right, how that would be built. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, there's now carbon reduction, carbon intensity scoring, and valuation provided within the value of that tax credit. And that's where the farmers come in, because we did fight really hard to make sure that climate-smart agriculture practices could participate in the 45Z program. We had to do that first by getting it into 40B. And so that is there, but again, we've got multiple agencies in the federal government that are weighing in on how this guidance comes out. Really, there's only one of them up there that knows much about agriculture, and that's the Department of Agriculture. And so when you have a lot of other agencies, a lot of other influences, these are the kinds of things that can come out of that. So you're correct. Secretary Vilsack is asking any interested parties, including trade associations like us, provide us, USDA, provide us some information we can use to go to bat for you, how to make 45Z better than what 40B came out. And that's exactly what's happening. We certainly very much appreciate the efforts of Secretary Vilsack in doing that.
Donnell Rehagen is with us, the Clean Fuels Alliance America. We'll have more with Donnell coming up here on the morning edition of the Cromwell Ag Radio Network. Good morning and welcome back to the morning edition of the Cromwell Ag Radio Network. I started this interview giving a melody of how letters and information passes back and forth. Think about this. There was a letter that came this week from various agriculture, nutrition, environmental groups. Over 500 of those signed on to a letter to Congress to say, get a new and modernized farm bill done. And there have been groups that have said and testified even this week before the House Ag Committee that says if you don't do something, there's going to be producers next year that under the economic climate are not going to be able to get operating loans. The safety net isn't there. Input costs too high, commodity prices too low, interest rates too high. We're headed for a train wreck. But one of the issues that I want to say almost as big as the Farm Bill, if I'm looking ahead, is this 45Z. Because if these rules are written as such that soybean oil and ethanol and other feedstocks that come from farmers in a field, if they're written in a way that is too restrictive, then agriculture misses the boat for what could be a tremendous flood of opportunity, especially as it pertains to aviation fuel.
Well, and Jeff, not just misses the boat, but quite frankly, where does all the feedstock come from then if agriculture is on the outside of this looking in? And so that's why we've really pressed that point with the USDA, with Treasury, with DOT, with DOE. All of those agencies are involved because you're talking about fuels that impact all of those markets, on-road, off-road, air transportation. So they're all involved with that. And yes, it's another example of the need for clarity. Farmers need that clarity, and the government needs to understand how long in advance farmers plan for what they're going to do. When you talk about things like fertilizer applications, no-till, when you talk about rotations, all of those things are things that farmers plan well in advance. And so dropping a rule here in the middle of August or the middle of September, the middle of November, by then some farmers have already decided what they're going to do next year, and it's too late. So there's just not a recognition of current farm practices among the federal government, among these agencies that ultimately get to make the final decision on how a program like this is going to work.
Well, I've made this point before. They've made, basically cover crops mandatory. Well, that's fine if the climate goes along with you, but according to USDA, right, cover crops can't be planted until the crop is harvested, and it doesn't do much good to plant a crop when the ground is frozen, which is what happens from northern Indiana, northern Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, North and South Dakota. It just don't work. But there are other things that they can do that would help that carbon score. But in the 40B, they weren't recognized by the Treasury Department. And that's why this is so important right now, that if we're going to get to play a part of that market, we need some clear and concise common sense rules if it's possible to get that out of D.C.
And a practical application, right? Because you're exactly right that not all geographies work the same. When you talk about agriculture practices here within the United States, and under 40B and then ultimately likely under 45Z, what's being proposed at this moment is that all of those practices have to be done, like in the sense of corn, all three climate-smart agriculture practices have to be done. And in the case of soybeans, both have to be done. One or two out of three is not good enough. So it's all or none. And so when you look at how agriculture really works, that is not practical. That's not practical for everybody. There may be locations in the United States where, yes, that could be done, but there's a lot of things that happen and, as you know, influence farmers' ability to impact and to make these kinds of decisions. Sometimes it's out of their hands, right? And so that's the challenge that farmers have with what's happening here with this legislation.
Well, one of the things I appreciated about Senator Grassley, and I have no doubt that man's involved in farming, he said, how will you know? When the truck comes to the elevator, how are you going to know which field that it came from? How are you going to verify identity for cropping practices? There's no mechanism of that in place.
Well, and that's been a lot of the discussion as they've worked through 40B guidance. And the sense that we've gotten from participating around the edges of that process is they've been struggling at the federal government level to understand what the the certifications or the verification programs are for these climate smart agriculture practices. So there's a concern that there's no way to verify. And so if that's the case, then you're going to have some in the government who are going to want to not provide incentive for practices that they can't verify. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in agriculture. There's a lot more verification and opportunities that are out there. And I know that's not something that most farmers welcome, somebody kind of snooping around the fences, right? But this is sort of where things are in this space now as farmers and agriculture become a key component in decarbonization and carbon intensity scorings of these feedstocks that are going into all of the renewable fuels, including ethanol.
So, Donnell, this is not legislation. This is not at a subcommittee. It's not energy and commerce. It's not on you. It's not on the ag committees. How do you lobby? If you're an organization like Clean Fuels Alliance America, how in the world do you make your point in D.C. and know that it's landing on the right desk and being heard by the right set of ears?
Well, this letter is a good example, of efforts that we can take to expand our voice. We've been, shouting from the rooftops for months and months, if not years, on this as they've started on 40B, trying to get the attention of the right regulators. And again, having folks like these members of Congress and the Senate who participated in this legislation, they know what they intended to do. They know what they wanted to accomplish. Sending a letter like this to the agency that's responsible, in this case Treasury, Secretary Yellen, and saying, hey, we want to make sure you're looking at things this way. We want to make sure you understand how critical and timely we need this addressed, because this is what we intended to, this is the impact we intended to have, and you can't miss this deadline, you can't miss this timeline. So those are the practices, that we as a trade association can have, but there's nothing like hearing from a lot of constituents. And so we've encouraged our commodity trade group partners to be doing these same kinds of things, not just letters, but actually getting into offices on the Hill, making phone calls. And these are things that your farmer listeners can do as well. Pick up the phone, call your senators, call your representative, and ask them what is going on with this, and explain to them the critical nature of the timeliness and how agriculture works. We all know, Jeff, there's just pretty much a lack of awareness of agriculture here in the United States among policymakers, both at the federal and the state level, and we've got to help fill in that gap.
So now I'm thinking toward this, and I know that you can't make fuel if you don't have feedstock. That's real. Well, one of the points that the Soybean Association made is the modeling. They want to make sure that the U.S. modeling is fair compared to the modeling that's given to product from overseas, whether it's bean oil from Brazil or canola oil, or whether it's used cooking oil. They want to know that the playing field is level and that they have an opportunity to participate. And this tax incentive, this tax break from taxpayer dollars is actually going where it needs to go.
Well, I think your storyline is exactly right there. I think we all want the same thing. We all want to see domestic fuels created from domestic feedstocks, and those fuels to be used here in the country. So that's a target. That's a goal, definitely. What we find ourselves in, though, Jeff, in this situation, not unlike fossil fuels and petroleum, we are an energy exporter. We have the ability to be a provider of energy all across the globe. And many countries are not at the stage or the level of expertise that we are in the development of energy. And so although I understand the need and the desire to have feedstocks that come and originate from the United States, we want 100% of those that we can get our hands on. But at the same time, we don't want that to be a hindrance to the ability for our industry to continue to grow and to supply those finished fuels, those clean fuels across the entire globe. So we would be looking to have a much more open and broad approach to the feedstocks that are coming into the United States to allow our producers of those fuels to continue to grow. I think we can find a kind of a common ground there and a right balance of being able to be a global producer of clean fuels while at the same time ensuring that we are utilizing first and foremost all of our domestic feedstock.
Well, Donnell, I wish you and I could flip out a legal pad and write out what it ought to be and send it to Washington and let them get it done. Unfortunately, we don't. we can't solve that problem in this conversation. But I did wanted, and I appreciate you being with us this morning to talk about the importance of this issue, the significance of this issue, and the many details that still have to be resolved that we frankly need yesterday, as opposed to waiting until sometime in 2025 to be able to participate. So thanks for being here, and I hope we find a successful conclusion here.
We'll keep working together, Jeff. Appreciate you.
Donnell Rehagen with us of the Clean Fuels Alliance America. I'm Jeff Nally. This is the Morning Edition on the Cromwell Ag Radio Network.